this tutorial, I will show you how to set up a workflow for moving files from one source to another, a folder in this case. I will then in upcoming tutorials add more features to the same workflow that we're now creating and make it a bit more advanced to take care of some common scenarios. I have prepared one input folder that will act as my source and one output folder where I will expect the result to end up when running my workflow. First we need to select workflows. And since this is my first workflow on this Corbit server, it's empty. Let's create a new one by clicking Add New. At the top, we can name our workflow, and it's a good idea to do so. In that way, you can easily identify your workflow later on when going back. I'll name mine Move Image Files. You may also give it a more detailed description if you like, but I keep it empty for now. As mentioned before, we need a source, my input folder. So let's add one. Add source. Create new, and then select folder. Once again, I may select a name for this source. This is the specific source in this workflow I'm creating. A good idea is to name it so I easily know what source it is. If I don't give it a name, the name will be suggested to be the same as the path to the folder itself. I just changed the name to input. Scan subfolders is used if I want Corbit to search for files in folders in the input folder itself. Not activating this will force Corbit to just search the input folder, so I'll keep it disabled. The rest of the settings, handle files in modification time order, forces Corbit to handle the files based on the modification time of the files. Handle invisible items. If hidden items or files should be handled, we should activate this option. Handle zero-sized items. Handle files that is just that. All of these three options are disabled by default. In the scan section, we will be able to set up the source for automatic scan or manually. The server will try to recognize changes in the source, and when this is detected, an automatic scan will be triggered. Just a quick note, this will not always work, for example, over some network and network volumes. So if we turn this feature off, we now have the possibility to specify how often or when a scan should run. Scan at activation just means that the scan will be triggered when you start your workflow, even if you have set it up to run at a specific time or day. Safety margin means that Corbit will wait for the given time from discovery before processing the discovered file. Maybe a larger file is added to the input folder, but has not been completely saved before Corbit discovers it. And finally, we have the standard setup for when a scan should run. We are able to choose from seconds, hours, days, or weeks. There are even more options found under the additional setup, but we leave that for now. Let's set the scan to run every 5 seconds and click Save. Now we have set up our source, and we can see it over here. Just clicking the 3 dots, and here's the input we just created. If I want to edit it again, I just double click here. But let's just cancel. And I'm also going to hide the arrow handling because we don't need it right now, so just switch it off here. Now when we have our source, we need a filter so Corbit knows what to look for. In our example, we will set up a filter that looks for JPEG images and ignores other file formats. And to create a filter, we click Add Filter, Create New Item, and select File. Once again, we may give our filter a name. I'll name it JPEG files. All restrictions must match. If we would set up a filter with multiple conditions or restrictions that should be met for the file or files to pass through this filter, then this option needs to be activated. Handle invisible items. This option is like the one we saw when we created our source, and it's used if we would like invisible items to pass through this filter. And finally, now we need to specify what this filter actually should do. As you probably already have guessed, we will have our filter to look only for JPEG files and ignore others. So I choose File from the drop-down menu. And finally, we type *.jpg to specify that only JPEG files should pass through. A quick note, as you probably can see, this text field is yellow tinted. This type of fields and text areas that you will find in different places and dialogues in Corbit indicates that it supports Corbit's powerful variables and macros. More about that in future videos. Moving on, there is an option for inverting the condition. If you would like all files except JPEGs to pass, then this will do the trick. But we leave this as it is right now. If we would like to add more conditions to this filter, then just click the plus to add a new one. But I'm just going to hit save. As you can see, a new block appeared, and this is our filter we just created. We are almost done, but there are some final steps. We must specify what should happen when the files meet the filter's conditions. This is done with an action. So this time we click Add Action, create New Item, and then we select Move. We may give the action a name. If we don't, a default name will be added based on the root folder we select. The root folder in this case is the desired destination of the files to be moved. So I pick the output. And now if I want, I can rename it. Routing folder is used if you want sublocation or locations to your root folder. File name. If we leave the name field empty as it is, then the file that will be moved will keep its original name. If overwrite is used, then Corbit is allowed to overwrite a file in the destination with the same name as Corbit is currently working with. Keep folder structure is used if you want the same structure in the end location as you had in your source, and the option to search subfolders was activated. Finally, we click Save, and our action appeared as a new block. All sources, filters, and actions have a various number of in and outputs. Hovering over most of them will give an explanation of how they are used. Source, for example, just have one output, and this is the route the workflow will take when handling a file that is discovered in the source. Our filter has one input and 3 different outputs. So let's connect the source output to our filter's input using a transition. You simply click the output and hold the mouse button and drag to the filter's input and let go. Now every file that will be discovered in the source will pass on to the filter. We also need to connect the filter's output to the action's input. So if the filter's condition is met, the file will be moved to our output folder. The output to the left is the one that we're going to use. The one to the right is used if the item does not pass the filter. So once again, we drag from the output to the input. Let's try the workflow out. We save what we've done. The workflow now appears as inactive. Let's highlight it and start it. Now the workflow is running, as we can see in the Corbit client. If we were satisfied with the setup, we could now close the client because the server is running. But let's test the workflow first. I'm going to bring up my input and output folder, and then I have prepared some test files that I'm going to drop in the input folder. As we can see, the workflow worked exactly as expected. The JPEG file was moved and the TIFF file remained in the input folder because it did not pass through the filter. In the next video, we will add some functions, taking care of the TIFF file that remained in the input folder, making a copy of all files that is moved to a backup folder, and add an action to delete non-wanted files in our input folder.